this morning. Yeah, the new fella going to put his hand up. I know we've got one or two, I know. I must admit, I'm not an intense history buff, but I do like to find out details about things that have happened in the past and their relevance to us. But when we study history, one of the events that are often documented in history are battles. Lots of battles have taken place throughout history. Some of them have changed the path of the nation or even the world. Someone wrote that conflict, or the propensity for conflict, is part of the makeup of human beings. Conflict, the propensity for conflict, is part of the makeup of human beings. And we can see this in our history books. The Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC. The Greek citizens faced off against the Persian invaders sent by King Darius I. The Persians brought navy ships bearing 20,000 infantry and cavalry to Marathon to punish the ancient Greeks for supporting the Ionians, who had revolted against the Persians. Despite being outnumbered, the Greeks led a forward attack that caused the Persian army to panic and flee to their ships. It's been suggested that the battle also gave rise to the story of, don't know if I can pronounce this, Phidippides, something like that, who supposedly ran the first marathon from the place called Marathon to Athens to announce the Greek victory. So that's why people run marathons these days, maybe as part of that remembrance. The next battle I'm going to mention is the Battle of Hastings. On October the 14th, 1066, the Norman invader William the Conqueror defeated and killed King Harold on Senlac Hill near Hastings in England. William the Conqueror held that the former king, Edward the Confessor, had promised him the English throne in 1051. But on his deathbed, Edward changed his mind and he actually tapped the nobleman Harold Godwinson instead. So William marshalled his forces to dispute Harold's claim and defeated the newly crowned king, and then went on to London, which surrendered to the Norman invader. And King William I was crowned on Christmas Day in 1066. The battle marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule in England. And then finally, another battle, which I'm sure you've heard of too, is the Battle of Waterloo. On June the 18th, 1815, January the 18th, that's our wedding anniversary, ain't it? June the 18th, 1815. I didn't know that. The Battle of Waterloo took place on that day. The British and Prussian forces, led by the Duke of Wellington, squashed Napoleon Bonaparte's troops at Waterloo in what is now Belgium. The battle was the final defeat of Napoleon, who had expanded across Europe starting in 1799. Unfortunately, we could go on talking about battles all morning that have taken place in history. It shows that conflict does seem to be part of the human makeup. However, most of us, thankfully, have not been involved in battles captured in the history books, but we still go through battles in life. I'm sure that you can think of a battle right now, perhaps that you're going through. Maybe you're at odds with a family member or a friend. Maybe things are difficult in the workplace. Maybe you're having a problem with a relationship. Perhaps it's an illness that's driving you down. Maybe you're suffering for some kind of addiction. We all fight battles in life, and they're difficult to resolve. I remember when I was at high school having to fight a few battles, particularly when they found out that I was a Christian and attended church. That was quite a battle ground, was that. My issue too is that I was one of the youngest kids in the year, having been born in August. And I wasn't very tall either, still not very tall, but I have grown a little bit from those days, which may be a bit of a target for anyone trying to be a bully, and there were a few of those in my year. But my saving grace was that I had some friends who were bigger than me in my year. And as a result, I had some good allies on my side, and that made life a lot easier for me. And I was more successful at fighting my battles because they helped me. You know, it's good to have someone on your side, isn't it, to help you fight your battles. This is what I want to speak about this morning. And there are lots of Bible stories in the Bible too about battles, actually. Even God's people, Israel, were involved in conflict on a regular basis. One such passage, really well-known passage in the Bible, is 2 Chronicles chapter 20. It's the story of King Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah. A vast army was marching against them. Actually, 3 armies were marching against them. They were afraid. You can imagine this, can't you? I would be afraid. They were outnumbered. They didn't see how they could possibly win this battle. So King Jehoshaphat turned to God in prayer and placing his trust fully in God. He knew he didn't have the strength to face the battle on his own. There was no solution that he could put forward that would be sufficient. And God told the king to have faith and trust in him. God said that he was fighting the battle. God said he was going to fight the battle for him. King Jehoshaphat was to take his army out into the battlefield and just trust that God would be with him. So King Jehoshaphat appointed men to lead them into battle. And what they just did was sing songs of praise and thanksgiving. Can you imagine that on the battlefield? He wanted their hearts just to be fully focused on God and on God's great goodness. And as they sang the songs of praise and thanksgiving, God fought the battle for them and defeated the vast armies of the enemies. As we read the Bible, we see time after time God fighting for his people. Pastor Rick Warren said this: whatever you're fighting today, trust God to win the battle for you. Whatever you're fighting today, trust God to win the battle for you. We can trust God to win our battles. There's a verse in the Bible which we can find in Exodus 14, verse 14, which says this: the Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. That's what he says. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. What a promise this is. God says he's going to fight our battles. All we need to do is remain calm and still in his presence. He'll do everything required to fight our battle. As God fought the battle for the people of Judah, so God promises to fight for you too. All we have to do is stay calm. God doesn't necessarily want us to fight with him. He just wants us to be still and let him fight for us. The context of this verse in Exodus is a very well-known story. It's the one where the people of Israel had fled Egypt when they'd been slaves. God had instructed Moses to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And God had backed this up with bringing several plagues in. Remember the story on the Egyptians, and it culminated with the final plague where the firstborn child of every family was struck down and killed. Pharaoh let the people go, but then he relented and sent his army to chase them down and to kill them. The people of Israel found themselves, can you imagine this situation, found themselves trapped on the banks of the Red Sea with this mighty Egyptian army bearing down on them. They could see them approaching. The people of Israel were frightened and panicked because of the situation, which you can fully understand. But Moses said to the people, the Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. What happened next was amazing, wasn't it? Moses parted the Red Sea so the people could pass through the sea on the dry ground. And then the Egyptian army thought they could follow, but they quickly began to realize when they did that things weren't going their way. We read how God confused the Egyptian army initially, and then he jammed the wheels of their chariots so they had difficult steering the vehicles, and it held up their progress. At this point, even the Egyptians began to realize that God was intervening on behalf of the people of Israel. He was fighting for them. And they began to think they should stop pursuing the Israelites because it wasn't going to end well. It was true, wasn't it? It didn't end well for the Egyptian army, because as they were crossing the Red Sea, God ordered Moses to stretch out his hand, and the water engulfed the whole Egyptian army. The Bible says not one of them survived. God had won the battle. His people were saved. Not one of the Israelites had to pick up a sword or a spear. God had defeated the enemy. He'd won the battle entirely himself. You know, we sometimes feel like the people of Israel did at that time. We're trapped by our circumstances. We don't have anywhere to go. We're staring defeat in the face. We're surrounded by our enemy. But God is saying to you today, I'm fighting for you. He's saying the same words that he said to the people of Israel. Don't be afraid, just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Lord himself will fight for you. As someone wrote, God is by your side through all the battles of this life. He will fight you. He will fight for you and direct your feet through your trials. I love the idea that God doesn't expect us to fight our battles ourselves. And I must admit, if I find myself in a difficult situation, I would probably start to think what I needed to do, what I need to do to get out of that situation. I don't have the resources that God has. I don't have the power that God has. I don't have the ability to change situations in the way that God does. God tells the people of Israel not to engage with the Egyptians, just to stand still and be calm and watch what he's going to do to fight their battle. It's the same with us. When we engage God in our battles, when we ask God to intervene, we just need to sit back and watch what God's going to do. In the story of the part in the Red Sea, who would ever thought that solution was a solution to their problem? Who would have ever been able to do what God did? No one could. Have we ever seen a sea being parted before? No, we haven't. It's only God who could do this. That's why we need to engage with God to fight our battles. It's only God who could resolve the situation in this way. We need to sit back and let God take control of our battle and see what he can do. What started me thinking about this subject was another story that I read fairly randomly in the Bible one day. It was a story in the Old Testament again, in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, about David. David was a shepherd boy who became the king of Israel. I think that's an amazing thing, isn't it? It shows the potential, just like you were saying, Jack, it shows the potential and possibility in all our lives when God is in the business. It shows David, the shepherd boy, became the king of Israel. What can God do in your life? The story starts when David is anointed as king, and one of the first things he does is build a great army around him to give him self-support. We see this same approach in other stories in the Bible as well. We see how when Jesus began his ministry on earth, what did he do? One of the first things that he did was call 12 men around him to support him for the 3 years of his ministry, the 12 disciples. You see, we can't do things on our own. We do need support if we're going to be successful. We need people on our side who are going to fight for us. As you look at Boris Johnson at the moment, we see that his support's rapidly diminishing, isn't he? And it's undermining his ability to achieve the things that he wants to achieve in our country. It's the same in the church. Church leaders, people in the church can't achieve things by themselves. They need people who support them and are ready to fight for them too. The Bible calls this unity, like-minded people coming together, developing a strong bond of support for each other. So David builds support for his kingship. I'm not going to read all the passage, but here are a few extracts that show us that the people David appointed to lead his army. It tells us about the people that David appointed to lead his army. I just thought this was amazing. Jashobeam, a Hakimite, was chief of the officers of David. He raised his spear against 300 men whom he killed in one encounter. Can you imagine that? One man killed 300 with his spear. Doeg, the Hiohite, one of the 3 mighty warriors, he was with David when the Philistines gathered for battle. At a place where there was a field full of barley, the troops fled from the Philistines. But they took their stand in the middle of the field. They defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. No wonder David wanted him on his side, isn't it, in his army. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down Moab's 2 mightiest warriors. He also went into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. And he struck down an Egyptian who was 5 cubits tall. David had him on his side as well. And we could go on talking about the mighty warriors that were in David's army, that David was recruiting into his army. Now, I think I would have wanted all these men on my side too, wouldn't you? If it was in David's situation, they were powerful, mighty warriors who were committed to David, who were willing to do anything to support him. And it was a verse in 1 Chronicles 12, in the middle of that story, that struck me, though, as I read this story. Verse 22 says this: "Day after day men came to help David until he had a great army, like the army of God." And it was that phrase, like the army of God, until David had a great army, like the army of God. I don't know why the writer of the book of Chronicles included that phrase in the story, but they did. After listing all the mighty warriors who joined David's army, men who had done great exploits on the battlefield, who were brave and strong and had fought well, the writer says that David's army was like the army of God. Did you know that God had got an army fighting for us? Did you know it was a great army full of mighty warriors who were ready to fight for God and ready to fight for us? It isn't a small army either. It's a great army that can't be numbered, and God is ready to employ his army for us in our situation. You might be thinking, well, where is God's army? Can't physically see it. This might be something you need assurance about, particularly when you're entering into a battle. It's so reassuring to know that someone is fighting for you. Well, there's another story in the Bible where this same issue arises. Again, it's a story in the Old Testament, and this time it involves a man called Elisha, a prophet Elisha, and his servant. And here is the context of the story. The king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants about strategies and specifically where was the best place to make camp. In the meantime, back in the land of Israel, God's prophet Elisha was warning the king of Israel, telling the secrets of the king of Syria's heart, including the location of where the king of Syria would set up camp. And the king of Israel followed Elisha's advice, and therefore he was one step ahead of the enemy king of Syria as a result. So Elisha was getting this information from God, who was passing it on to the king, and they were able to be defeating the king of Syria. It greatly troubled the king of Syria, as he suspected there must be a traitor in his camp. It had to be someone close to him passing on this secret information. So he summoned his servant and demanded to know who it was. And his servant told him that actually it was Elisha the prophet in Israel that had special powers and was telling the secrets of the king's heart. So the king of Syria was fearful of Elisha, and he was angry. So he demanded that the servant go with a great army of horses and chariots to get Elisha and to stop him. Can you imagine Elisha against an army of horses and chariots? In 2 Kings chapter 6, we pick up the story, and it says this: "When the servant of the man of God, Elisha, arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots." The king of Syria had done exactly what he said he wanted to be done. And Elisha's servant said to him, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" You can imagine this was an extremely difficult situation. Elisha and his servant were surrounded by a great army who wanted to capture them and probably to kill them. So Elisha answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, I pray, open my servant's eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. It was God's army. God's army was there. The servant of Elisha couldn't see it. Elisha could see it, and Elisha prayed that his servant could see it there. He was surrounded by a physical army, but there was this God's army, spiritual army, that was more than the army of Syria. The king of Syria had sent an army to capture Elisha, but God had sent his army as well, which was far in excess of the army of the king of Syria. Elisha's servant couldn't see the army, it was hidden from him, but God opens his eyes, and he can see that the army there that is fighting for them. There is a worship song we sometimes sing, and the word says this: "This is how I fight my battles. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. You know, sometimes we're just like Elisha's servant. We're surrounded by an enemy. We're surrounded by circumstances. We're surrounded by problems in life. We don't know what to do. We might feel overwhelmed. We feel under attack. We feel on the verge of defeat. We can't see a way out. But God says, just open your eyes, your spiritual eyes, and see the resources at your disposal. God's army is fighting for you, a vast army, a powerful army, an army that is far greater than anything this world can throw at you. You may feel the enemy surrounds you, but if you just open your spiritual eyes, you'll see actually that God surrounds you in your difficult times of life, in your battles in life. God surrounds you. God is fighting for you. Remember the words of Elisha when you feel that you're defeated. There are more with us than those that are against us. There are more with us than those that are against us. When God's employed in a situation, God is with you. God's army is a mighty army. Think back to David's army, the great warriors that we've talked about that were fighting for him. The Bible likens God's army to David's to show us how great the resources are at our disposal and the mighty warriors that are fighting on our behalf as well. Remember, we're not alone. We're not by ourselves. Whatever is happening in our lives at this time, God is with us, like he was with Jehoshaphat. He was with the people of Israel when they were being chased down by the Egyptian army. He was with David, and he was with Elisha. And God is with you. God is fighting for you too as well. You may be thinking, well, how do I engage God's resources when I'm in a difficult situation? How do I ask God to fight for me? God shows us throughout the Bible the best way to face our battles is with prayer. Been reading a really good book this week called How to Pray by Pete Greig, the founder of the 24/7 Prayer Initiative. And he says in his introduction that his book is a simple guide for normal people. So that attracted me to the book, a simple guide for normal people. The book contains lots of stories about how powerful prayer can be. And I just wanted to share one of these stories with you that shows that God is fighting for us when we pray. The story is in a section of the book called Intercession. These intercessory prayers are powerful prayers that can make a dramatic difference. And this intercessory prayer that I'm going to read made a dramatic difference. You'll see what I mean. Pete tells the story of Jonathan, a member of Pete's church, who works in London and arrived very early for a meeting in Westminster one morning in August. As he walked across the River Thames on Westminster Bridge towards the House of Parliament, with 2.5 hours to kill, he found himself thinking back to the terror attack that had taken place there the previous year. And as he did so, he sensed a new and imminent danger so powerfully that he needed to pray. He began to pray for protection, not something he's ever done before, not something he would normally do. And he continued pacing the streets of Westminster and praying for an hour. It was so strange, he recalled, and so strong. I walked and prayed around that area, praying for the safety of those who work in Parliament and the offices nearby. One of my offices when I was working was nearby Westminster, just nearby as well. The hospital over the bridge and the crowds of commuters. Eventually, around 7:30 a.m, Jonathan stopped praying and stepped into a coffee shop near the bridge. It was just 7 minutes later, and 100 yards from where he was sitting, that terrorists drove his car into cyclists and pedestrians in the precise place where Jonathan had been praying between Westminster Bridge and Parliament. As Pete Greig said, we will never know for sure this side of eternity what difference Jonathan's prayers made that day. But what we do know is the attack on Westminster Bridge the previous year had left 50 people injured and 5 dead. But this incident killed no one and left 3 people with only minor injuries. Those 3 injured people received assistance within seconds of the attack because the vehicle immediately behind the terrorist car happened to be an ambulance. What's more, CCTV footage revealed that the terrorists had been driving round and round those streets for an hour before the attack, as Jonathan had been walking around the streets praying and sensing danger and praying for protection against this, precisely against this kind of attack. In this powerful story, we firstly see the power of prayer, and particularly a prayer that responds to a God-given sense that there's need to pray for something. If you feel you need to pray for something, take time out to pray for it, because God's asking you to do it. It's important. Also, we can see that through prayer, God is fighting for us. It can make a difference. God fight. We can engage God in that situation through prayer. This morning, I want you to know that God loves you, and he loves you so much that he's fighting for you. Phil Wickham has written a song called "The Battle Belongs to the Lord," and here are a few extracts from the lyrics. When all I see is a battle, you see my victory. When all I see is the mountain, you see a mountain moved. As I walk through the shadow, your love surrounds me. There's nothing to fear now, for I am safe with you. So when I fight, I'll fight on my knees, with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Whatever battle you're going through this morning, remember, the battle belongs to God. God is a mountain-moving God. He's a God who can part the sea. He's a God who loves you with a significant and strong love, whatever situation you're going through in life. Remember, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for us, who can be against us? Whatever battle you're going through today, the battle belongs to God. God is fighting for you. All of us can engage our powerful, mighty God by coming to him in prayer, by fighting on our knees, as Phil Wickham writes, and our mountains this morning will be removed. I hope that sort of spoke to you in some way. I just really felt really quite strongly about that theme, and I just hope that I've been able to put over a few thoughts about that's maybe helped you to understand that God is fighting for you this morning. Amen.